On the bottom of page 487, we come to this section about speakers' choices. The author here points us back to previous sections where we've learned before that speakers don't really care a lot about the hearer's ability to understand and comprehend. They care more about how difficult or easy it is to produce some piece of linguistic utterance. Now, the shape of a language is constructed by the way that people use it. There is no really definitive right or wrong. There's no authority out there that's able to say, I am the person in control of this language, the English language, for example. I am the person who gets to dictate how people use it. Rather, however languages are used determines what is correct within a language. For this reason, as you recall a couple chapters ago, I posted a short video about African American English and their use of the concept of code switching in elementary schools to help African Americans have avoid adopting a feeling of inferiority about their own language. The principle underlying that video was that there is no right or wrong within a language, that how a language is used makes it right. That may sound counterintuitive to you, but really that's the way it necessarily has to be. Otherwise, our language today, English, would be wrong because we are using it differently than people used to use it when they spoke Old English. And anybody who doesn't say thee, thou, and thine when they're speaking to another person would be incorrect. But we would say now that we don't have to use those words because it's correct not to. The only reason it's correct not to is because enough people did it differently enough times that it became the correct way, the common or accepted way. So, this section is talking about how it comes about that people begin to use a language differently than their predecessors used it. In the first paragraph on page 488, the first full paragraph, we see in the middle of the paragraph that it says, learners of a language sometimes over-regularize the input they hear. Right? So you remember from a previous, just a couple of sections ago, that that when participants hear a certain word order given in the artificial language, that they often overgeneralize that given word order, and they repeat it back to the experimenters during the test phase, like 80 to 90% of the time, instead of 70% of the time. Right? So that's what they're saying here, that people overgeneralize the input they hear. So the next generation of language users would be even more prone to exaggerate those statistical differences. So with each passing generation, pre-existing differences would become more prominent. Now, this hasn't been experimentally analyzed, but one way to look at this would be to, if you switch back to the study that was done on page 484, if you were to have these people who just learned this artificial language teach it to somebody else, then their input would be they would have generalized their responses over 80% of the time. But then the next group of people would, if you had this first group of people teach the artificial language to a second group of people, that second group of people would also overgeneralize the rules until just a couple of generations of learning this artificial language, you would see that all of the responses made in the artificial language would follow a certain pattern, the pattern that's given in the condition that was originally presented by the experimenters. So here we find then that there's one plausible way presented that English could have come about with the SVO word order that we use today. If you look at page 489, there's a number of sentences that illustrate how you might be able to order words in a sentence, the students devoured the free pizza. If you were to rearrange the words in the sentence in different ways, then you would see different examples of word orders that are possible, right? But for instance, this last one, the one that's object, verb, subject, the free pizza devoured the students, that makes that tells us something totally different from what the first sentence tells us. But the author presents all of these sentences here and says, imagine, for instance, that all of these sentence orders were perfectly acceptable ways in a precursor to English, some generations upon generations ago, that if you wanted to tell about students eating free pizza, that you could say the sentence in any of these 6 ways, and any of them will be acceptable, including that very strange last version. If there was any pressure at all for people using that language to pick one of these word orders over the others, then in just a few generations, all of a sudden, people would continue to overgeneralize, and people would use only one of those acceptable versions. Originally, all 6 of them would have been acceptable, but within just a few generations, just maybe 1 or 2 of them at most would be acceptable. That's one possible way that an SVO word order could have come about. It seems a strange way, and no research has necessarily experimented to make sure that that's a plausible way, or that's even how it likely could have occurred. But there is research to suggest that there is pressure there's pressure for the SVO word order to have been used more frequently than the other kinds of words orders. That pressure is described at the bottom of page 488. Recall that in previous chapters we've read that when a word or phrase is highly accessible, that speakers want to just get it out as quickly as possible so that they can clear up their working memory, and they have an easier time then working with the rest of the sentence. So if they can get the subject out of the way first, then they're likely to do that. But the last paragraph on page 488 says, if people are planning a sentence, then they're more likely to grab the animate object in the sentence and stick it out there first. The research that we have that suggests that is that if you're trying to convey that a truck hit a boy, then you're actually more likely to say the boy was hit by the truck than to say the truck hit the boy. And the reason for this is because in memory, we have an easier time grasping animate objects. They come to the top of our mind easier. So we can, in our working memory, we can extract that word, that animate object, the boy, and we can stick it out there, we can say it, we can get it out of our working memory, it's already been said, we can stop playing with it, and then we can proceed with dealing with the rest of the sentence. So we get that animate object out of the way, even though, in this case, the animate object is not the subject. In this case, the subject is the truck, because the truck is doing the hitting, right? So we are likely, in this situation, to place the animate object first, even though the animate is actually the animate object is the animate thing is actually the object of the sentence. So that's the research that suggests that we're inclined to spit out the animate object first. But usually when we're talking, the animate object, the animate thing in the sentence is the subject of the sentence. Usually the animate thing is doing the verb. Almost always, right? Usually it's the boy that's walking. Usually it's it's a duck that's flying somewhere, or a bunny that's hopping somewhere. If it's a live thing, then it's more inclined to do a verb than if it's not an alive thing. But the point here is that by having this slight memory bias that makes us want to spit out the subject first, not the subject, the animate object first, then we are biasing ourselves to an SVO word order. We are biasing ourselves to want to spit out the subject before the object. And if you look at the figure 12.6, this map of the world suggests that most that most languages in the world, a vast majority of them, use the subject first, and then either the object or the verb next, with about equal frequency. But very few languages use the object first, and then spit out the verb and subject. Because we are inclined, through this memory bias that we have, to spit out the animate object first, and the animate object is almost always the subject. And over generations, people generalized this rule, and even if a language started out allowing any word order arbitrarily, with repeated use through generations, we would see that languages would begin to restrict the word order that is allowed, such that only a word order that allows the subject first might be used.